there, ain't she pretty?
I
wish I still had Hammond records. I would have had George in the studio.
This is 60 years of the jazz scene. And I've known Nat for the whole 60 years. So we've been to the wars together, and we loved together and hated together. But I mean, he is the greatest. And everything he has to say in his book is beautiful. And he writes about the most wonderful musicians in the world. So buy the book.
Okay, everybody's had a little bit of a say. What sort of a say do we have in the audience? Does anybody want to ask a question? Here's the gentleman right here.
Hent2, Mr. Hent2, how many books have you written in your life, both fiction and non-fiction?
Books have I written? I think the number currently is probably about 30, and they include a number of books on jazz, books on the Constitution, which is under siege now by President Obama, who is following the legacy of Bush and Cheney. I've written books for young readers, and for fun, I've written a couple of police procedurals, detective stories, and I'm writing another book now. It's called Is This America? And all you have to do is realize that as we're sitting here, this has never been a more society under constant surveillance. The Fourth Amendment is on life support, and I won't go into a whole disquisition about my current obsession that we send drone planes. They're piloted thousands of miles away so nobody gets hurt, and they kill people. There's no judge to decide whether the people they kill are innocent or not. So I have a lot to write about.
You've written about 30 books?
Yeah, about 30.
Hey, Martin Learning School. I have a question. Obviously, I know your commitment to social engagement and civil liberties. And I'm wondering, with jazz's history of often being a music that has been deeply engaged in social advocacy, deeply engaged in civil rights, etc., can jazz, again, somehow become a voice for a purpose? How can jazz become a music of social engagement, or is too much time passed?
How can jazz become music of social engagement? That's what it always has been. Now, but in terms of its impact on American history and people, one of the main factors in the civil rights movement is the degree to which jazz preceded it.
Do you think it's possible
Not only in terms of what the musicians were playing, and then later Max Roach's Freedom Now Suite,
Can you ask
etc.
Jack?
But we have, and this is a personal example.
So ask Jack if he can turn up the Q&A mic anymore.
There is a man named Norman Graham, who was an extraordinary producer of jazz. He had jazz musicians who had never, or sometimes even played with each other, doing extraordinary things. And he played all around the country. But one thing he did, and this shows you how far back this was, he refused to play down south or any place else where there were black and white seating. He'd even go around the auditorium and take the signs, colored, white, tear them down. And sometimes an aggrieved person would say, I don't want to sit next to that person. Okay, said Nolan, I'll return your money. And there's a man in the audience named Tab Hershon who was writing the first definitive biography of Norman, University of California Press. But the whole history of this music and the kinds of what George was talking about, what goes into it, and Jim was talking about as a day-to-day experience. What really captivated me when I was a kid, I'd meet these people and they seemed to be larger than life. And they knew so much. Not only were they themselves taking risks every night, but they traveled. They would tell me about poverty on the streets of India. And I remember Duke Ellington one night said to me, he was talking about the most authoritative newspaper columnist at the time, Walter Lippmann. And Duke said, "Oh, I read him, but I've been there." And these people talk about social interaction. They are also our living historians.
George, this is something that you might want to pick up on, because the quality issue in all the concerts that you produced over the years has always been a major factor.
I hate to, it's Matt's book there, but I noticed my book on sale back there with his book.
Buy George's book too.
I didn't know it was people had any copies of it available for sale. But in there I tell the story of how I went to New Orleans to do it. They brought me down there to do a festival in 1962, which was before the Civil Rights Bill was passed. And they wanted to do a jazz festival. And I was not confrontational. Norman was a little more confrontational than I was. I was married to a black woman. I didn't have to be confrontational. and so I married in 1959 before the Civil Long when we would have been arrested in 25% of the states. But the point is, when I spoke to those people down there, I said, well, I'd love to do a festival here. I said, but you don't have integrated seating. And they said, well, we started thinking about it, and they said Kennedy had been down there, and they'd had integrated seating outdoors, so maybe they could have integrated seating outdoors. They're trying to get around their own laws. I said, well, that's okay. I said, but we have, the bands, most of them have mixed white and black musicians. Oh, we can't have that here. What we can do maybe is have a white band and then a black band. I said, no, I don't think that works, And a couple of other things like, Duke Ellington stays only in the best. He's treated like a king wherever he goes, treated like a duke wherever he goes. And he's not going to stay in a hotel on the other side of the tracks. Well, that's very difficult, and they use a little different expression that no end want to stay in my hotel. That was a very famous man who was a Hewitt Long guy that owned the Fairmont Hotel at that time. The Roosevelt Hotel was called. Well, whatever it is, in 2 years they called me back before the whole country was talking about passing the Civil Rights Bill. And they said, and we were all wondering, and they told me, we're going to pass the Civil Rights Bill next month. I want to come down, we want to talk about the festival again. I mean, so jazz was there. They wanted jazz, and they wanted the life to change and the laws to change, the Jim Crow laws, so they could have jazz and listen to it. And so as far as jazz's place, that was very important. And let's face it, back in I'm surprised Nat didn't mention this because he's an expert on it and can tell you exactly what records that it was. But Eddie Condon was doing records with Fats Waller, and then back in the 30s when nobody was doing this, and never mind that Benny Goodman had Teddy Wilson and Lionel, even before Benny Goodman had time. And so the integration of jazz musicians was because the music belonged to everybody. And the musicians understood that. And so that's jazz has its very important place in the whole history of the whole history of the movement.
What other questions do we have?
Well, you mentioned Benny Goodman. I think he and Artie Shaw should be given more credit. They're probably the earliest integration of black musicians with white bands, and that occurred in the 1930s, way before other aspects of the civil rights movement. And I think the records and their efforts should be properly given enormous credit. That was quite a breakthrough, don't you think?
I think the statement was that Artie Shaw and Benny Goodman had integrated that. Is that the question? Oh, we all knew about it at the time, so did the country. It was sometimes almost a news story when Teddy Wilson became part of Benny Goodman's outfit, and Billie Holiday was with Artie Shaw. And Charlie Christian was with Benny Goodman. And of course, Billy was there, but when they traveled, and Billy couldn't be at the same hotels that they were. Which reminds me, by the way, there's a guy who's not considered a jazz singer, but if you listen to him in small combos or any time, a man named Frank Sinatra, when he was making it in Las Vegas, he got so angry at the fact that people in his band who were not his color couldn't stay where he was staying. So he finally began to make a big simus about this, again and again, and it was a musician, Frank Sinatra, who broke the color line in Las Vegas.
Well, musicians have traditionally done this. I mean, the first records that I know of were some of those Eddie Condon and Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller records from the late 1920s. Coleman Hawkins played with Eddie Condon, and Eddie Condon played with Louis Armstrong, and so forth. It wasn't unusual among the musicians. The musicians have always been light years ahead of the people that they were playing for. There was a question.
Jim, longtime fan. I'd like to ask, if I may, why did you gravitate to the guitar? What turned you on about that? Two-part question.
Yeah.
Did you hear somebody playing at some point in your childhood and said, I want to be that guy? And secondly, as a jazz great, do you listen to rock and roll, particularly of our generation, the 60s and 70s, and do you admire any great rock and roll players, be it Clapton or anybody else?
Pretty complicated question. Ask me the first part again. But, how did there's a bit of humor in this. A few years ago, somebody in Europe put out a bootleg record, and my name on the cover, and I wasn't even the leader on a bunch of it. But the liner notes were great. Talked about music in my family. Said my mother was a pianist, my uncle, her brother, was a guitarist, and that my grandfather was a conductor. So my mom played terrible kind of Baptist church piano. My uncle, he played hillbilly guitar, and my grandfather was a conductor on the railroad in Ohio. But her brother, my uncle, Ed, he played the guitar. So anyway, my mom was responsible. She bought me a guitar when I was 9 or 10, something like that. And what was the second question? What kind of streets were you?
Did you listen to the great rock players that you admire or like him?
I don't want to sound prejudging, but I don't really listen to rock and roll too much. I know Eric Clapton a bit, and I like it and everything. I don't get it, frankly. I'm not even putting it down. It just seems kind of childish. It's nice to dance to, but I can't dance anymore. My grandfather was a conductor, so what
Can you all comment on what you think the jazz scene is today and how that's changed?
Well, jazz scene is always changing. That's part of the life force of the music. As I said, Sidney Bechet said it, you can't hold it back. Now, George wrote an article recently that I found very invigorating. He had been going around the clubs, not only in New York, but other places, and he was hit by the verve of people, some of whom he hadn't really known before. And it's always changing. Doesn't always change for the better. I am not a big fan of certain kinds of music that is all showing the pyrotechnics, how many notes you can play all at once, preferably these days electronically. And they never heard what Dizzy Gillespie once told me. He said, it took me most of my life to find out and to learn what notes not to play. And I'm a little concerned about the growth of what may become robotic jazz. There's a combo in Europe, I forget its name, but on the front line, there's a robot.